Welcome back, everybody. I'm Larry, and this is Southern Exposure, information and inspiration for the amateur photographer. Let's talk about masks. In my last video, I talked about artificial intelligence and its potential impact on the field of photography. That video was mainly focused on generative AI, the stuff that can, in theory, create an image from scratch based on a text description. Today, I want to look at one of the ways that artificial intelligence is already having a positive impact. It's in the way that Lightroom handles masks. Masks have always been one of the most powerful editing tools in Lightroom. I use them all the time to highlight points of interest in a photo, make a model's eyes pop, balance the exposure of the sky against the subject, etc. I want to take a quick run through the basic masks first. After all, this channel is aimed at the amateur and even beginner photographer. If you're familiar with the basic masks, I'll put a timestamp in the corner to jump to the more advanced topics. So what exactly do masks do in Lightroom? It's a tool that allows you to apply changes only to a specific area of a photo as opposed to the global adjustments that affect the entire image. You typically want to complete all of your global edits before applying any masks. Get your exposure and colors where you want them, then go for the masks. The changes within the masks can be things like exposure adjustments, texture, clarity, dehaze, saturation, etc. So let's look at the most basic masking tool, the brush. Here's an image from a wedding I recently attended. I've already made the basic edits, so let's jump into the masks. In the Develop module, click on the masking icon. It's all the way to the right in the group just below your histogram. This will let you choose what kind of mask you want to apply. I'm going to select brush. You'll see this little window pop open showing your new mask. I like to make sure Show Overlay is checked so I can see what areas I'm masking. From here, you can adjust the size, feather, flow, and density of the brush. I'm not going to go into those too deep. You can experiment on your own with those. Now, I just click, hold, and drag on the image to paint the areas I want to affect. You'll notice that the mask restricts itself to some lines and shapes in the image. That's because I have Auto Mask checked and Lightroom is trying to guess what it is I'm trying to paint and refine the mask for me. That can be pretty handy. Say I want to brighten up the ferns on the porch. I brush over them to create my mask, then I just move the exposure slider and only the areas I have painted get brighter. That's a really nice feature, but what if I don't want Lightroom to refine my mask? Just uncheck Auto Mask. Now the mask will be exactly where I paint. For this image, I wanted to bring out the porch lights, so I brush over and around them, then make exposure adjustments until I like how it looks. This is a great way to draw attention to light sources in your image. Next, let's look at linear gradients. Now, I almost never use the vignette tool in Lightroom. If I want to darken the edges of a photo a bit to draw attention to the subject, I use linear and/or radial gradients. The linear gradient allows you to mask an area based on a straight line with a fade. You can think of it like a graduated filter, but in post-processing. Select the linear gradient, then click, hold, and drag on your image to place the filter. Don't worry if you don't get it perfect the first time. You can make any adjustments you need to after it's placed. Once you have the gradient where you want it, just make your adjustments. I'll lower the exposure a bit to de-emphasize the gravel pathway, and again for the sky. Finally, we'll look at radial gradients. It's much like the linear gradient, except it's based on an oval rather than a straight line. Select the Radial Gradient tool. Click, hold, and drag to place the mask. Much like the linear gradient, I get the general shape and size first, then just make adjustments. I'll show you two uses for the radial gradient that I employ quite often. First, I'll use it to create my vignette. I'll create the radial gradient around my subject and adjust it until I'm happy. Now, you might think that I'm just going to grab the exposure slider and drag it to the right to brighten up the subject, but that's not really the best way to apply this effect. Remember, I got my exposure where I wanted it before applying the masks. What I do instead is click the three-dot submenu for my radial gradient and choose Invert. Now everything that was not part of the initial mask is selected. To create the vignette, I pull down the exposure slider. This is one of those edits where less is more. If you look at your image and you can see that it has a vignette, you've gone too far. Unless, of course, you're doing it intentionally for effect. The second way I like to use the radial gradient is to emphasize the directionality of the light source. This is one that doesn't come up often, but in the right circumstance can really elevate a photo. Case in point, this portrait of my neighbor's cat. We can see that the light is coming from the upper right, and we can even see a window in the background. So I'm going to make a large radial gradient in that corner. I zoom out because I only want the edge of the mask to overlap the corner of the frame. Play around with the size and shape, then raise the exposure. Again, less is more here, but by simply brightening the corner of the image that corresponds with the light source, we pull this out of the realm of snapshot and more towards portrait. That's the basics. Now let's get to the good stuff. Lightroom now incorporates some AI that helps you create very detailed masks quickly and easily to automate some common tasks. You can automatically create a mask of your subject, the background, the sky, etc. These are very cool on their own and a welcome improvement for those of us who used to spend hours creating and refining complex masks. But where you really unlock the power of these tools is by combining them. Here's a great blue heron I shot on the Chattahoochee River one evening. Again, I've made all of my global adjustments, and I'm pretty happy overall, but the water's just a little too bright for me and distracting from my subject. If I just drag a linear gradient up from the bottom and darken it, I'll end up darkening part of my subject as well, defeating the purpose. I could use a brush tool with auto mask selected to paint the water and not the bird, but that's still kind of tedious. Instead, I'll make the linear gradient to cover all of the water. Now, I'll click the Subtract button, which will allow me to erase part of the mask, and I'll use the Select Subject feature to unmask the bird. Now, I have a simple linear gradient to darken the reflections on the water, but have quickly and easily carved out my subject so the exposure of the heron remains unchanged. This may not seem like a big deal, but this opens up some powerful editing techniques that just a few years ago would have required some serious skill in Photoshop and hours of masking and refining. So take some pictures, fire up Lightroom, and start getting creative with masks. Thanks for watching.